Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley, and I am the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. Throughout the day, we engage in self-talk. That voice we hear, our own, is normal and at the heart of our thoughts. Sometimes the voice is kind, sometimes it's neutral, and sometimes it's quite mean and we beat up on ourselves. Some of us may even admit to being quite skilled at beating up on ourselves. Why do we do this? Is it helpful? Spoiler alert, not so much. Turns out when our self-talk is filled with criticism, we tend not to perform at our best. It's as if we go through life with a bunch of haters booing in our ears. That can bring on feelings of shame, increase anxiety, and make us less loving toward others. Wouldn't it be cool if we could opt for a gentle, wise, loving voice? How about the loving, encouraging voice we might use on a friend? And what would happen if we could tune in to that encouraging voice and make that the inner voice we listen to more frequently throughout the day? Spoiler alert, lots of good stuff. The science overwhelmingly supports practicing self-compassion as being good for our minds, bodies, relationships, and our abilities to perform at our best. As you will hear in this interview, self-compassion was hardly studied 20 years ago. Fortunately, in recent years, it has been under the microscope thanks to the pioneering work of two amazing people, one of whom is the guest on this interview. Dr. Chris Germer is a psychologist in private practice who also teaches at Harvard Medical School and to audiences worldwide. He has authored several books, including The Mindful Path to Self-Compassion, which I loved, and so did Library Journal, which lauded it as one of the best consumer health books in 2009. In this interview, he generously shares his expertise on how to practice self-compassion and the benefits it will play in your life. So listen in as Chris and I talk about why and how to practice the simple, scientifically supported superpower of speaking kindly to yourself, called self-compassion. And as always, the content on Super Psyched is for informational purposes only and not intended to diagnose or provide any kind of healthcare treatment. For that, please consult your doctor. Dr. Christopher Germer, who has asked me to call him Chris, welcome to Super Psyched.
Thank you, Adam. It's great to be here.
I've been such a fan of your work for so long. And for me, this is a real great moment to share your work with my listeners who I know will benefit hugely. I like to start with why, kind of like Simon Sinek in his TED Talk says, start with why, because we're oriented to care more when we attend to the why of a thing. So I'm going to ask you, why is self-compassion so important?
Because life is tough.
Totally.
Yeah. So it's really very much a part of the human organism, of human beings, to have our emotions regulated through kindness. It starts literally from day one of our lives. And most of us hope, and if we're fortunate, also receive kindness and compassion for others, especially when we're suffering. But actually, we don't receive it enough. And that is to say, there's nobody else on this planet who knows exactly what we're going through any moment and what we need better than we know ourselves. And so therefore, to have the capacity to bring kindness and compassion to ourselves when we need it the most is actually an essential skill for living. And the research bears this out. And fortunately, it's also something that we can learn. I should perhaps add that the research shows that the vast majority of us, 68% of us, are more compassionate toward others than ourselves. So when people hear about self-compassion, they often cringe. They think, oh, self means I'm going to become more selfish, compassion, weak. But really, what self-compassion is just including ourselves in the circle of compassion, just like slipping ourselves in the corner of the picture somewhere, at least for starters, because we systematically exclude ourselves from the compassion in our lives. We're just so much better at giving it to others and giving it to ourselves. So self-compassion training, which, as I said, anybody can do, is really a way of correcting the imbalance.
I think it's so great. And I'm absolutely sold on the idea. I know that our default is to not necessarily be self-compassionate. In fact, we can be kind of black belts at incurring perhaps the opposite types of messages. And I'm going to get into that in a minute, but I'm curious, many listeners may need to be disabused of the idea that self-compassion isn't going to make us weaker, self-indulgent, somehow more complacent or narcissistic. How would you respond? I know how I would, but I want to hear it from you. How would you respond to people who scoff at the idea of self-compassion?
Yeah. So first of all, people come by their scoffing honestly. In every culture I've ever visited around the world teaching self-compassion, there's a kind of prohibition on self-kindness and, in a good sense of the word, self-love. We're supposed to direct all that stuff outside. So definitely people feel a kind of hesitation about self-compassion. But there are a few things I could say. First of all, if you start to practice self-compassion, you're probably going to realize it's not self-indulgent or selfish. In other words, I say, try it and see what happens. But if a person is wary and says, yeah, but like, what's the proof that I'm not going to ruin my life? You can just begin to take a look at the voluminous research on self-compassion. In 2003, there was one article on this subject, which was published by Kristin Neff. And now there are almost 4,000 articles in the academic literature which have self-compassion in the title. And there are a lot more studies which include self-compassion. And the evidence is just overwhelming that self-compassion is good for us. It increases sense of well-being with a host of other qualities like optimism and wisdom and compassion for others and resilience. And it decreases negative states, anxiety, depression, stress. It improves our relationships. People who are self-compassionate, they're more collaborative, more likely to admit mistakes, work together toward resolution. And it's even good for the body. You know, states of self-compassion are associated with enhanced immune system functioning. People who are self-compassionate tend to have healthier lifestyles. They drink less, they eat less, they exercise more. So the evidence, the research evidence is overwhelming that this is a good thing to do. It's good for us. It's good for others. But the best indicator of whether it's good for anybody in particular is to just start and see what happens.
Totally agreed. And one of the hilarious things that you said during one of your trainings was, if you're a graduate student and you want a publishable study, just correlate self-compassion with any good outcome. And in all likelihood, you'll find that there is a relationship. So it seems like just the opposite of any idea that we'll become more narcissistic. In fact, we have a greater capacity to hear other people's experiences when we're self-compassionate. We're more able to express contrition. You and I both share a high regard for Molly Howes, who wrote the book, The Good Apology.
Amazing book.
Amazing book. An incredible interview too. So we're far less likely to be complacent. And even the Navy SEALs have received the memo that self-compassion can make them faster and better. Can you elaborate on how a person's performance could actually improve while they're being more self-compassionate?
I think there are a host of different ways, but the one that comes to mind immediately is that when we are trying to do something that's very difficult, in other words, when we have a lofty goal, inevitably we will fail over and over. And it is through failing that we learn. And frankly, it's through failing and then recovering and working hard that we develop confidence. And so self-compassion is a remarkable resource for dealing with failure in a productive way. In particular, when somebody who's self-compassionate has a misfortune of some sort or fails or doesn't work out, they don't get caught in shame. Shame means I'm bad, something's wrong with me. There's like self-criticism that goes on inside. And the typical reactions when we feel ashamed are to withdraw or to attack, but not to step back, look clearly at what happened, and have the energy to make amends. So when a person fails and is self-compassionate, they basically can say, oh, that didn't work out. They might be a little tender with themselves because it didn't work out, but then they have the inner resilience or the capacity, which comes from self-kindness. In other words, an inner voice says, hey, you know what? It didn't work out this time, but you're on the right track. Let's figure out what it was. Let's keep going. That's the voice of who is self-compassionate and fails. So failures actually become springboards for success when we're self-compassionate. So it helps us to deal with failure. But the other interesting thing about self-compassion is that it's people who are self-compassionate are actually more motivated to achieve their goals, not less. And the reason is that they have an inner voice, which is the voice of encouragement and kindness, rather than the voice of criticism. And all of us know, I mean, any of us who have been athletes and had a coach, or anybody who's been really in a student or trainee position with a mentor or a coach, knows that we need to hear encouragement and from our coach. We need to know that our coach has faith in us, believes in us, has our back. All those qualities are qualities of self-compassion. And I can perhaps lastly say, I have a trainer who's like a 26-year-old guy at the gym, and he's really helped me to cultivate my inner compassionate voice, because I recall once I was doing some push-ups and I basically collapsed on the mat. And he said very spontaneously with a really nice tone, he said, excellent, Chris. Exercising to the point of failure. Good job. And I thought, what's excellent about that?
Failure was too short in my mind, but actually a good thing. As you've been talking, Chris, I've been thinking that self-compassion could even be considered having Yoda or Obi-Wan Kenobi in your ear.
I think so. You know, when we're self-compassionate, we know ourselves, we care about ourselves. A really core part of knowing ourselves is authenticity. Mm-hmm. When we're self-compassionate, we're actually more authentic.
Totally.
You know, we know in the business world, for example, that business leaders who are self-compassionate, they often have more what's known as authentic leadership. In other words, there's a kind of truthfulness about what leaders are saying, which then inspires confidence. So self-compassion enables us to look at ourselves in a kind, non-judgmental way. We can be more honest with ourselves about what we're doing and who we are, and we can communicate that with others, and it's good for everyone.
So true. And I'm watching this great show. Perhaps you've seen it on Hulu, starring Steve Martin and Martin Short, No Murders in the Building. And you see Steve Martin, who's an older gentleman, and he's going out on a date, and the date, the woman exposes so much of herself. And when it comes his turn, he says nothing. And she just basically says, date over. Like, this is as far as we go. And I think that we are only able to share of ourselves. I think of this Winnicott quote that mental health can be shown, I'm paraphrasing this, by our ability to know another and to share of ourselves. And I think that the more self-compassionate we are, the more capacity we have for both. And then I start thinking about self-talk, which we have all day. So just to the listener, we all have self-talk. It does not mean that there is a sign of psychosis if you hear yourself talking. But let's say I forget my keys. I can't find where they are. And my first knee-jerk response is, wow, how could I be such an idiot? And it's akin to a Google search in my mind that will yield about 1 million results. I'll think about all the times I was an idiot, but it's not going to help me find my keys. And it's not going to help me feel better about myself and trust myself. And the quality of our questions really determine the quality of our life. And I think that self-compassion, when imbued into our verbiage and how we speak to ourselves throughout the day, well, it can either feed us or bleed us. And fortunately, with tendency to adopt many of the strategies you endorse, we can be far more open, far more available to others, far more true and authentic in this lifetime. And yet there does seem to be a default that we become black belts over time at just roasting ourselves and just self-harming through some of the most witty but cruel self-talk. Why does that seem to be our default rather than self-compassion?
Well, I think there are a lot of reasons for it. First of all, I love the metaphor of black belt because black belts train a lot. In other words, they don't get there like entirely at birth. You might need a little physical capacity to get to become a black belt, but you train. So I think it's safe to say that we train ourselves in self-criticism as we can train ourselves in self-kindness. But the interesting thing, Adam, is, as I mentioned before, I've taught self-compassion throughout the world, and every culture that I've taught self-compassion in believes that it's because of their culture that so many people in their culture are self-critical. So in China, they say, well, it's because of our Confucian background. In Argentina, they say, well, it's because we're Catholic. In the Midwest of the United States, they say, well, we're Lutheran, we're just drivers, we're not doing enough. Every culture has their explanation. So I think culture contributes, but I think ultimately it comes down more to physiology. And that is the first reaction that we have strictly for survival when things go wrong is the threat response, which is fight, flight, and freeze. But nowadays, most of the threats that we experience are threats to our ego, to our sense of self. And so when things go wrong, we still have this immediate response, this fight, flight, freeze response, which in the absence of an external threat gets turned on ourselves. So fight becomes self-criticism. Flight becomes a kind of self-abandonment or shame. Freeze becomes kind of getting stuck in your head, ruminating. And self-compassion is exactly the opposite. Self-compassion has a different physiology. Rather than a threat physiology, it's the care physiology based on hormones like oxytocin, the love hormone, and the endorphins, feel-good hormones. So rather than cortisol and adrenaline, we have a different physiology with self-compassion. And also, instead of self-criticism, we have self-kindness. Instead of self-isolation, we have a sense of common humanity. And instead of rumination or self-absorption, we have mindfulness. So I think it's a different physiology. And the physiology of care is slower than the threat response. The threat response is very fast. But to be able to step back and say, oh, wow, basically to be mindful of feeling threatened, and then to have as a new first response, kindness to ourselves because we're feeling stress and discomfort, can actually set us on a new track physiologically, a new track cognitively, a new track behaviorally. And that's ultimately what we do in self-compassion training. We develop a new response to when things go wrong.
I love that. And I've heard you refer to Donald Hebb, one of the fathers of neuroscience, the person to whom the axiom neurons that fire together, wire together is attributed. A lot of people may be listening and saying, Chris and Adam, I'm too old for this. I'm too set in my ways. What would you say to those individuals?
I would say, first of all, self-compassion is a relief. When we think about self-compassion, we think, oh, this is another thing I need to do. It's a lot of work. I need to have time for it. I need to squeeze it into my life. My life is too full. And besides, it kind of gives me the creeps anyway, so I'm not going to do it. But actually, a moment of self-compassion is a relief. In other words, where something goes wrong in our lives and we're feeling stressed and we're ruminating and we're getting physically tense and basically we're uncomfortable. Imagine in that moment if somebody came into your life, somebody who you love, said something nice to you, patted you on the shoulder or gave you a hug or whatever it is, exactly what you need. Basically, someone popped into your life at just the moment when you needed them and they made you feel better. You wouldn't say, oh, that was a bad thing. And we could do that for ourselves. When we give kindness to ourselves, when things are tough, we relax, we calm down. And when we calm down, we're less self-absorbed. We can see more clearly what's going on. We can make better choices, better decisions. So what I would say to anybody who says, oh, brother, not one more, self-improvement thing, I would say, actually, what it really is about is letting go of stress in a way that will make your life easier. What we say is if it's a struggle, it's not self-compassion. It's something else. It's called struggling. That's self-compassion. If it doesn't sound like that, it's not self-compassion. It's something else.
When those two utterances of and I heard two distinctly different feelings. One is relief, and the other one is something almost akin to the way I'd feel if I saw a cuddly thing, like a little kitten on a video. That's what those sounds registered in me. Was that what you intended to emit?
So self-compassion has mindfulness in it. It's a key part of self-compassion. And the sound of mindfulness is really that, but then there's a sound of caring. And if we're caring for something cute and cuddly, we might say, "Aw," but sometimes we're caring in a way like we feel the enormity of somebody's pain. And we could still have a sound, might sound something like, "Oh, I get it," or "I see you," or "I'm here with you right now. I'm feeling you," Anyhow, it's a sound of caring. So mindfulness is kind of the sound of spacious awareness and letting go, and compassion is a sound of care and connection.
So if you were to be asked to give a rather succinct definition to self-compassion itself, how would you define self-compassion?
I think the best informal definition is when we suffer, treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding as we would treat a good friend. I think it's a helpful definition for two reasons. One is it really points to how self-compassion is a U-turn, that we naturally are compassionate toward some other people when they're suffering, and we're not necessarily compassionate to ourselves when we suffer. As I described, we often ruminate and get self-critical and stuff and become impatient with ourselves. But we can do a U-turn. The same kindness, understanding that we give to others, we can actually give to ourselves. So that's helpful in that way. But Adam, it's also helpful because often somebody might say, well, what exactly should I do to be more self-compassionate? Or when we're in a stressful moment, maybe the mind goes blank and we just don't have a clue. It's just like, you tell me. So if we can remember, self-compassion is when I'm struggling to give myself the same kindness and understanding as I give a dear friend, we can ask ourselves, you know what? Right here and now, if I had a good friend who felt exactly like I do, or just went through exactly what I went through, what would I suggest to my friend? What would I say to my friend? How would I treat my friend? And then do that for ourselves.
So beautiful. I believe in the Bible, it says something akin to love your neighbor as yourself. What you're saying is love yourself as you'd love your friend.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Right. Yeah.
That's beautiful. Yeah. And can you describe some of the methods that you recommend for starters who wish to initiate a practice of self-compassion?
The general conceptual frame, I think we just said, which is this matter of treating ourselves as we would treat a friend. What's interesting? There are three universal expressions of compassion. One is a soft gaze. Another is soothing touch. And a third is gentle vocalizations. You can go anywhere in the world and people get it. They understand compassion through those expressions: soft gaze, soothing touch, and gentle vocalizations. And so if a person is looking for a quick way of being compassionate with themselves, they can do a few things. They can close their eyes and imagine the face or the eyes of somebody who genuinely loves them in that moment, to visualize those eyes and give oneself permission to bathe in that gaze. Even if it's the gaze of your puppy, it's a sweet thing. It'll change your physiology. So that's one. Second is soothing touch. Many people find if they put one or two hands over their heart in a moment of stress, that it changes their physiology. In fact, a study just came out in Germany 3 months ago that showed that when people do that, it lowers their cortisol level, which is a sign of stress. And then the third, gentle vocalizations. If you ask yourself, what do I need to hear right now? What do I need to hear? If somebody were to walk into my room right now and say something, and when I hear it, I would just feel, thank you, I needed that. What would that be? What would those words be? So maybe they would be things like, I'm here for you, I love you, I get it, I understand. And then say those words to ourselves. That's a bit of a higher bar because people feel squeamish at first, but after a while, it doesn't make that much difference. And frankly, to the unconscious, doesn't matter if it's coming from outside or inside. The only thing the unconscious understands is state of mind. And so if we can take in a kind state of mind that we're imagining somebody else has toward us, it's going to change our hearts and mind.
Each of us has different magic words that register something deep in our hearts and our unconscious, and just really that can be very healing. And I imagine that your phrase might be different from mine. And I know that when it comes time for me to actually relax, I feel kind of compelled to work. I need to tell myself something akin to, okay, sweetie, you deserve to relax, enjoy. Like an old grandmotherly presence saying, yes, you've done enough. You can chill now. Yeah. I don't know. Do you have something that you say to yourself?
Well, it really depends on the situation. And there are hundreds of different situations, but I think we need permission to stop striving. We've been just so trained to just not waste a minute, just keep on trying to accomplish something, or else we're not living up to our potential. Even if the potential is to serve others, many people just drive themselves into the ground for that too. So to have some language that says, you know what, you've done enough service for today, you can rest. That's beautiful.
You've done enough service for today. That's beautiful too, because it also speaks, I guess, Chris, to one of your values, and that is to be of service, and that you've made quota, and now it's time for you to serve you in this way.
Yeah, I think that's the case for most of us. I mean, you, Adam, we're having this podcast right now because you want to give something that you consider of value to the world. And so you could be skiing right now, or you could be doing this. Why are you doing this? It's because of your compassionate heart. So compassionate motivation can also wear us out. So it's good to give a little compassion to ourselves and say, you know what? Enough for today.
Yeah, let's go there for a second, because I know that you and I both think a lot about compassion fatigue as an experience that many people who are caregiving, particularly for the sandwich generation who have parents who are aging and still have children at home, people who are frontline workers who are really helping. How might self-compassion assist them?
So really what you're speaking to is there are two words that are spoken about in this context. One is compassion fatigue and the other is burnout. Mm-hmm. And compassion fatigue is a subset of burnout. Burnout refers to how in our work, and it could be caring, as you said, sandwich generation, caring for younger people and old people. But when there comes a time that we are physically exhausted, when our attitude is starting to change, like we start hating the people we're supposed to be caring for.
Right.
And also when we find ourselves really not very productive, i.e. we don't want to get out of bed because we just don't like our work. Anyhow, this is burnout. But there's a subset of burnout, which, and by the way, self-compassion has been shown over and over again to alleviate burnout. But it's also been shown to alleviate compassion fatigue. And compassion fatigue is really what we call empathy fatigue. Burnout refers to exhaustion about what you do. Compassion fatigue is exhaustion regarding who you're taking care of. So compassion fatigue means that when we're working with people who are suffering a great deal, like say if you're a nurse in a COVID unit or something, and you're seeing people who are super sick and they're also dying and their family members are distraught. As a human being, we feel that in our own bodies, in many respects, as our own. I mean, we don't feel it as intensely as the person themselves who's going through this pain, but we definitely feel it. This is called empathic pain, and it can also be called vicarious trauma. So compassion fatigue wears us out because we feel another person's pain as our own. So then the question is how to alleviate, say you want to continue caring for your kid or your elderly parents, you want to continue working as a doctor or a nurse. How do you do this in the midst of so much suffering? And compassion, I think, is really tailor-made for this sort of thing. In other words, when you have too much pain giving compassion to others or feeling empathically their pain, the natural thing is the U-turn, to give yourself kindness first. And actually what we find is that stress goes down and our capacity to be compassionate toward others improves. So the question sometimes arises, but how do I do that on the spot? Usually when you hear, how do you alleviate compassion fatigue? People say, well, you got to see fewer patients. You need to take time off. You need to go on vacation. You need to go to Club Med. Like basically what it means is don't do as much as you're doing. And that can be useful, but you still want to return to your caregiving activities inevitably, right? So, but how can you do it in a way that doesn't suck the life out of you right away? And I think that the answer is self-compassion, but there's a really handy dandy exercise, Adam, that people can do while they're caring for somebody. And that is to find their breath, like the body breathing in and the body breathing out, which is naturally happening all the time. And just give yourself the privilege of letting the in-breath to be for you and the out-breath to be for the person you're caring about. And so you're struggling, you want to just scream at your elderly parent who doesn't seem to understand what you're saying. Right then and there, feel your breath, breathe in for yourself, nourish yourself with the in-breath. Actually do this as many times as you need. In for me, in for me, in for me. And then at some point, out for you, dear parent. And what this does is it actually puts us back in the picture. The reason why we develop compassion fatigue is because we are not paying attention to our own suffering. We're only trying to help others. But if we track the breath, we see a more natural balance. And when we can breathe in for ourselves, that simple U-turn, that simple attention to, yes, you too are here. You too value. You too are suffering. You too need care. All of this starts to happen in the brain when we inhale for ourselves and then exhale for the other reconnects us. It's amazing medicine.
I think it's brilliant. And, I sometimes have to drive to the hospital to get a checkup, and battling traffic and parking and getting there just barely in time. They shove a blood pressure cuff on me, and lo and behold, whoop, it's a little bit high. And I say, hang on 1 second, let's just try this again. I just do a few rounds of breathing. And it's interesting how you came up with the in for me and out for the parent. I believe that the breath in engages the sympathetic nervous system, while the exhale, and you're nodding, engages the parasympathetic. And that puts things in such a nice, appropriate balance. But I can certainly vouch for the idea that it's all under our nose all the time, that breathing thing that we have access to that we kind of forget about. And that's probably the quickest way to re-regulate. And it sounds like it also has a
re-regulate to get the balance right in caregiving. When we're unbalanced in terms of attention to others and disregarding ourselves, we're going to burn out. And so this just resets the balance.
What might be some other methods you mentioned earlier, of exercising self-compassion that might be easy?
Yes. So there are mental practices and there are contemplative practices, and then there are also behavioral practices. So among the behavioral practices, to ask ourselves, how would I treat a friend? Or how do I care for myself already? And then do that when we're struggling. Or the quintessential self-compassion question is, what do I need? What do I need? What do I need to feel safe? What do I need to protect myself, to provide for myself, to motivate myself? What do I need to comfort myself, soothe myself? So we could break it down. But anyhow, this is all behavioral self-compassion. Then give yourself that. So this is huge, because most of the time we are not meditating. We're not doing contemplative things. We're in the world behaving like a normal person. And so to be able to be compassionate those 18 hours of the day is a really good thing. But there are also mental practices which actually, you could say, attune the mind to being compassionate during the day. In other words, if in the morning you took 15 or 20 minutes to meditate in a particular way, you're more likely to be compassionate during the day. And so there are a number of practices that you can do there. People can go to the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion website to learn about different kinds of meditation. But I guess what I'd like to say is that in daily life, when we have a really stressful time, it's good to have a handy dandy informal practice that gets right to the heart of self-compassion. And that is what we call the self-compassion break. And my colleague, Krista Neff, developed this originally. And she also was the person who created the scientific definition for self-compassion, which is based on three components: mindfulness, common humanity, and self-kindness. And the self-compassion break basically has those three parts. So to do a self-compassion break, number one, we take a moment to acknowledge what's happening. And so mindful awareness is to be able to say, oh, this is tough. This is a struggle. This is painful. This is a moment of suffering. To just name it. Maybe even to name an emotion that you're having, like, oh, I'm feeling so sad, or I'm feeling so stressed. Or physical mindfulness, which means to be able to notice where in your body the stress is located and see if you can make a little room for it, a little space for it. So this is part one, mindfulness. In a nutshell, just to be able to say, this is a moment of suffering, or this is a moment of stress, that's enough. That's enough to actually make a step back and have a little perspective, a little space, so that there's room for a compassionate response. Part two is common humanity. That's the second component of self-compassion, which means, why can we acknowledge that we're struggling? Because struggle is a part of life. Because in our moment of struggle, we are not alone, even though it may feel like we're alone, because this is part of being human. So to connect, to just step for a moment out of our self-absorption and to be able to say, whoa, this is not easy. And this is probably, I'm not the only one in the world who's ever felt like this. It's such a relief. It's such a relief, because our suffering is magnified hundredfold when we feel isolated alone. And then the third part, Adam, is self-kindness. And we can give ourselves self-kindness in many different ways. But the three ways that I mentioned before, soft gaze, soothing touch, and gentle vocalizations, are perfect for self-kindness. They're really self-kindness practices. But it's really useful to practice self-kindness along with mindfulness and common humanity. Many people think self-compassion is all about self-kindness, and then they're likely to think, oh, this is about sugarcoating. No. To be truly self-compassionate, you need to be able to see things clearly. We need to understand that this is part of the fabric of human life, and then be kind to ourselves. And that it's no spiritual bypasses, no sugarcoating. It's actually leaning into the hard points with courage and kindness.
And I love that it's so rooted in truth, in reality, in authenticity. Unlike, as much as I love Saturday Night Live and Stuart Smalley, it's not because I'm good enough, smart enough, and doggone it, people like me. And it's just not just fluff and saccharine that's not necessarily true. It's all rooted in reality. The mindfulness, it's a lot less Stuart Smalley and a lot more roomy, in that this being human is a guest house. Every morning there's a new arrival. It could be a whole host of different feelings. So recognizing the universal nature of our experience and realizing that we're part of the brother sisterhood. We're all siblings on this planet going through this. And I think that's brilliant, and being real with what's going on in the present. Some other really exciting things that you have been uncovering have been some fMRI studies that have been corroborating the effectiveness of self-compassion with various populations, including people who suffer chronic pain. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, well, I was a member of a research team at the Cambridge Health Alliance here in Boston. And we were doing research with people with chronic lower back pain. And we taught them 12-hour self-compassion training. And then we looked at their brains, the impact. And indeed, there were brain changes. And in particular, we noticed changes in the frontal part of the brain, which is responsible for executive function or controlling stress. And there were a few different brain areas that had changed. And also, by the way, these changes correlated with reductions in subjective distress around the lower back pain. But I think the main take-home message, perhaps for your audience, Adam, is that it really doesn't take a lot of self-compassion training to benefit ourselves, even with something as chronic and annoying as lower back pain.
I myself have suffered it. And I remember it was particularly exacerbated when I had difficulty reconciling two distinctly different thoughts I had about a bad experience. And I couldn't reconcile them. And my back just went haywire. And required from me was being really honest and present and able to, something that you talk about extensively, to name with accuracy what was actually going on and just to be present to it without judging it, without edge. One of the things that you also share is that, self-talk in a self-compassionate moment is not using, an edgy voice and not blaming or shaming or all of those other things that we tend to be, so, as we said earlier, so good at doing, which can only intensify the pain. You've also brought in something that was so cool, and that self-compassion can help people with sleep issues. I was wondering if you could speak about how self-compassion can help with sleep.
So I think the underlying mechanisms behind alleviating chronic lower back pain and also insomnia is the same. And that is that the evidence is very clear that self-compassion reduces fear. As they reduces activity of the sympathetic nervous system, it increases a sense of safety, which amplifies the parasympathetic nervous system. And so when people can't sleep, they usually get into a vicious cycle of getting aggravated about not sleeping. And that tends to activate the threat system. In other words, the worse it gets, the more upset people become. So what does it take to just kind of get off that treadmill and give the body room to sleep? What does it take to get out of our own way? And in my view, a lot of love, a lot of kindness, a lot of sympathy, frankly, for the simple fact of not sleeping. In other words, to understand, there are millions and millions of people in this world that don't sleep. You do deserve to sleep in a good way, but maybe we need to go about it in a new way. And so this really gets to the heart of self-compassion practice, Adam. And that is when people start to practice self-compassion, like say to themselves kind words like, may I be free. I know somebody who had this beautiful mantra for sleeplessness. And frankly, I tried it myself and it was fabulous. And it was, may I be free from fear. May I be free from shame. May I be kind to myself. May I be kind to others. When I say those four phrases, if I wake up with a nightmare or if I'm just fretting, I just say those over and over again. It's amazing. It works like a charm. However, what inevitably happens when people first start being kind to themselves, perhaps with loving kindness phrases, is that they say, woohoo, this works. And then their motivation changes. In other words, first we say the phrases because I'm a broken person who can't sleep. We just love ourselves up because we're a mess. That actually works like a charm. Then we start to use the same phrases like a medicine to make sleeplessness go away. And when we do that, we actually start activating the nervous system and we will not sleep, because when it doesn't work, we get more frustrated and we get back in the same old cycle. But then we learn that actually the way to practice is not to make our negative experience go away, but to embrace who we are already. This is what's known as the central paradox of self-compassion. When we suffer, we practice not to feel better, but simply because we feel bad. As the poet Hirschfeld says, it's like the eyelid blinking when the eye is dry. Or if you have a child who has like a 5-day flu and it's day one, your kid's going to be down for 5 days, but you love the kid anyway. Why? We love the kid anyway because the kid's suffering. How about ourselves? We all have the flu. We're all suffering all the time. How do we approach that? Usually we get on some crazy self-improvement agenda, which basically is, as Bob Sharple says in Australia, he talks about the subtle aggression of self-improvement. Usually we just start going after ourselves when things aren't right. What would it be like if we just put this entire thing on a new footing? To love ourselves because we are a mess, because we're broken, because we can't sleep. when we do that, it's amazing. This self-compassion works like a charm. So ultimately, Adam, in the 8-week mindful self-compassion training program, our goal of the training is to shape or to refine intention or motivation. Everybody starts this training with the wish to be more self-compassionate. And by the middle, they realize this ain't happening. I can't do this. I'm not good enough. And then by the end, they usually realize actually self-compassion training is not about perfecting ourselves, but to embrace our imperfections. It's not about, as Jack Kornfield says, becoming more perfect. It's about perfecting our love. It's about compassion first. And when we do that, self-compassion is remarkably powerful.
And one of the things that runs central to everything you're saying is something you said a few minutes ago around attunement and being attuned to ourselves in the way that a loving, caring person would be attuned to the other, asking, what do I need right now? And I'm thinking about Dan Siegel and his idea of interpersonal neurobiology, and the most predictive element of good outcomes with psychotherapy being good attunement seems to be the key factor. And it sounds like the key factor towards good self-compassion is attunement, just as you said. And I'm only inferring based like halfway through the 8-week program that people run into that wall, that maybe some of that might be backdraft. Is backdraft a part of what's going on? And can you tell the listeners what backdraft is in case they encounter it themselves? They know, oh, this is actually a thing.
Yeah, so backdraft occurs in the beginning and the middle, and backdraft will occur as long as we live. But for your listeners, backdraft literally means the distress that arises when we give ourselves compassion. So if I say to myself, may I accept myself just as I am? Inevitably, the mind, when it hears that, will think, well, there are certain unacceptable parts of myself, and I have actually been treated in unacceptable ways in my past, darn it. And we start to basically have all kinds of negative thoughts and feelings. And this is inevitable because the mind only knows anything by contrast. We know high because we know low. And so when we start to open the door of our hearts and the love goes in, the pain comes out basically. And this is actually how self-compassion heals. It's not a problem, We had a participant in one of our trainings who said, it feels like Kabul, but it's really kablooey. Because as this stuff comes out, because the kindness is going in, but when it comes out, like even an experience when we were 5 or 10 or 15, when we re-experience these things in the present and have the resources of mindfulness, which is to be able to create space for it, and compassion, which is to hold it in a loving way, we actually can reparent ourselves. We actually can heal those wounds because now, as adults, we can give ourselves what it was that we did not receive earlier in life when we needed it. So in this way, very naturally, just by building the resources of mindfulness and compassion, we can, in a slow and gradual and mostly safe way, heal old relational wounds.
Awesome. Well, before I ask my final question, can you tell us where the 8-week program, how people can have access to that?
Yeah, so there's an organization called the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion. The link is centerformsc.org. And there are 3,000 teachers around the world on every continent. And since the pandemic, most training has gone online. So anybody can really access self-compassion training by going to that website. There are trainings starting all over the place, and not just through the Center for MSC, but the teachers are throughout the world are doing online trainings in all languages. All languages means I think the program has been translated to 20 different languages so far. And at the Center for MSC, there are different levels of training. They're introductory, like 3-hour trainings, 6-hour trainings, 12-hour trainings, and the regular training is 24 hours. And then there are also training programs and so forth for graduates. There is free stuff as well. So if somebody's interested in learning self-compassion, they could attend a online Circles of Practice training. Circles of Practice group, which is like 3 times a day. And people can just drop in and you'll learn how to practice self-compassion.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, Chris, my final and fantastical question. If you possessed the magical ability to confer on all humanity a skill or an insight that would help people immensely, what would that skill or insight be? And how do you imagine it would help the individual and society at large?
Well, that skill would be compassion.
And how do you imagine it would help the individual and society?
Non-referential compassion going in all directions, including oneself. And there's just not enough of it. We're going through some tough times around the world and we need systemic change. But in order to sustain systemic change, we need individual change. So I think that on many levels, we need to grow. But in my view, probably if there's one thing an individual could do at any given moment that will have important impact in the world, it would be to grow in compassion. And I think the easiest way to grow in compassion is through self-compassion. Just like falling in love, we fall in self-compassion. It's easy. And that's my wish, compassion.
Chris, I totally agree. And I think that would be my wish as well. And I would imagine, as you and I are kind of talking about this possibility, that hate groups would cease to exist. People would be able to recognize their authentic selves during this lifetime. People would be more courageous. The number of positive outcomes from what you just suggested seem infinite, quite frankly. Okay, well, Chris, I'm aware that today represented an opportunity cost to you. You could be out skiing, but instead you decided to share your wisdom and your expertise with my listeners. And I just wanted to thank you from the bottom of my heart for showing up so fully.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed this conversation, Adam. And I wish you and your many listeners all the best.
Thanks, man. This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.